Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Mitch Case, and I'm with the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures and readings, and much more. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you are interested in becoming a member of the NAC or would like to earn information, or would like more information, please email admissions@thenationalartsclub.org. Now I'm going to share a brief welcome from Michelle Kidwell, chair of the club's Archaeology Committee.
Thank you, Mitch. I am Michelle Kidwell Gilbert, Chair of the Archaeology Committee. I wish to welcome the audience joining us this afternoon for a most special online presentation relating to diversity and inclusion entitled Antiquity in Gotham, Ancient Architecture in New York City, co-sponsored by the Archaeology and Architecture Committees. Just so you know, Steve Cass, Chair of the Architecture Committee, will offer final remarks near the conclusion of this program. It is my great pleasure to introduce Archaeology Committee member Elizabeth Macaulay-Lewis, a tenured professor holding a bachelor's degree from Cornell University and a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Lizzie's previous club lecture was entitled The Art of Place, Roman Gardens and Paintings, plus she wrote Gardens at Aphrodisias for the Aphrodisias Scroll, when our committee honored 50 years of excavations at this beauteous Anatolian site. She has additionally authored numerous books and articles, as well as arranged conferences on assorted topics related to the field of archaeology. Today, you'll learn how the appropriation of varied antique world traditions both celebrated the past, while at the same time announced New York's readiness to move into the modern world as a cultural mecca. In particular, classical architecture was reinterpreted for American purposes to symbolize the aims of the country while affirming resiliency and alluding to disparities within society. Few places in the United States undertook this better than our own Gotham, adapting historical edifices while constructing unique buildings and monuments, a legacy anticipating its future global preeminence. My pleasure with Lizzie.
All right, thank you very, very much, Michelle, for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the Archaeology Committee, as well as to Steve, Cass, and the Architecture Committee as the sponsors of this talk. So what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about antiquity in Gotham. Here we go. Thanks. So the skyscraper is often considered to be the quintessential building in New York City. And the city's skyline, of course, is dominated by tall towers. This image tells a particular story of New York City's architecture, but not the whole story. Today, I'd like to argue that the architecture of ancient Greece, Rome, and the ancient Near East were essential to the creation of some of New York City's most famous and iconic architecture. Now, the ancient architecture of Gotham has been a focus of my research for about 10 years since I returned back to New York City after about a decade abroad. I've done an edited book with Matthew McGowan, who's based at Fordham University, and I'm currently completing a book called Antiquity in Gotham, the Ancient Architecture of New York City, that will be published by Fordham University Press next year. Now, unfortunately, my favorite way to talk about this is to roam all around New York City. But since we can't roam around due to the pandemic, I'd like to take you on a virtual tour to several boroughs to demonstrate that ancient architecture was a creative touchstone for many different New Yorkers, from basically before the city's founding through to the present day. But before we start on that journey, I'd like to emphasize that the classical world has always been a source of political ideas, artistic creativity, and architectural forms for the citizens of the United States since the nation's inception. Now, since the fall lecture theme for the National Arts Club is E Pluribus Unum, the motto of the United States, which you can see on this slide, I thought it was worth bringing up quickly. It is particularly germane to the talk, and it may derive from Cicero's phrase, which translates to "as several united in one." Now, the use of a Latin phrase for the US motto underscores that classicism and the ideas of Greece and Rome were always central to the United States' conception of itself. The classical world was a deep source upon which Americans could draw to promote diverse ideas and agendas. Now, it's always been on the US Great Seal, but it's now also on the Great Seal of the state of New York. And this is kind of interesting. I learned this due to my colleague, Matt McGowan, who shared this with me, that in April 2020, at the peak of the pandemic, or what we hope was the peak of the pandemic, although the numbers this week may lead us to doubt that, was that Governor Cuomo added E Pluribus Unum to the Great Seal of New York. Of course, the Latin word Excelsior, ever upward, has been the New York State motto since 1777. But the adding of E Pluribus Unum to the Great Seal is a reminder that we are all into this together and that we are New York tough, as I'd like to say. So furthermore, the 9/11 Museum also has a quotation in translation from Virgil. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to visit the 9/11 Memorial, and it's composed of two waterfalls with reflecting pools embedded in the footprints of the original Twin Towers. The names of those who perished are inscribed in bronze, and the memorial is set into a moving grove of trees. The museum, which charts the tragic events of 9/11, concludes with this quotation: "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," from Virgil's Aeneid. Now, some classical scholars have challenged whether this verse is appropriate, but perhaps the power of the quotation, as Matt McGowan has argued, lies beyond the claim of an individual people or contemporary religion. It is effectively timeless. So the 9/11 Memorial and the museum are the most recent in New York City's long tradition of using memorials that appropriated Latin and classical art and architecture to bring dignitas and gravitas to a monument. Now, the tradition originated with the Montgomery Memorial or Monument, the United States' first ever memorial, which honored General Richard Montgomery, who died at the Battle of Quebec on December 31st, 1775. He gets a shout out in Hamilton. Alexander Burr says Montgomery took a bullet in the net when he's trying to convince Washington to hire him. And of course, Washington hires Hamilton. But the battle was very important. It was the first American offensive of the war and resulted in a major defeat. Montgomery's untimely death transformed him into a much needed martyr whose death Congress could use to galvanize support for the revolution. So in order to commemorate him, Benjamin Franklin commissioned Jean-Jacques Caffieri, Louis XVI's royal sculptor, to design the memorial. Pierre Elephant, the designer of Washington, D.C., installed the monument according to Caffieri's detailed instructions, which were sent from Paris. Now, the monument was originally a cenotaph. He was not actually buried here until I think almost about 1810. And it was composed of a marble column with an urn on top that you can see set against an obelisk of bluish black-gray marble. Flanking the urn, which you can see here, is the Club of Hercules with a phrase Libertas Restitutia, the Pilios, the cap of liberty worn by slaves when they had been manumitted, so ex-slaves. Now, the phrase Libertas Restitutia is a very well-known phrase. It appeared on the coinage of Galba and Vitellius, who were both briefly emperors in 69 CE after Nero's suicide. And the coin in turn drew on the coin that Brutus had minted after the assassination of Julius Caesar. The words are really easy. Liberty restored. It's a pretty easy cognate for anyone who knew Latin or who doesn't know Latin to understand what the monument celebrates. It celebrates the smashing of British tyranny and the freedom that Americans were trying to win for themselves. The palm branch, which is also included here, which you can see also is a symbol of victory. So while there were not a lot of major tombs or chapels in New York City at this time, the combination of the urn and the column and the obelisk, it's important to note that one as well, was very common actually in 18th century Europe and 18th century Britain. So this visual language of antiquity that we're seeing here, you will see time and again is an ancient vision that is refracted through European culture. And it's a way partially of stating that the United States was participating in kind of a global culture, albeit certainly a European one at this point. So with that brief introduction, I'd now like to start to take you on a tour all over the island. Now, unsurprisingly, Greek Revival architecture became incredibly popular for many of New York City's important buildings during the first half of the 19th century. Greek and Grecian, that is kind of Greek-inspired architecture, embodied the ideals of democracy, and in particular of ancient Athenian democracy. Now, ancient Athenian democracy was a radical experiment, as many of you know. It gave rights to male Athenian citizens to serve on assemblies and juries. While it did exclude non-citizens, slaves, and women, for the time, the 5th century BC, that was kind of extraordinary. So it's not surprising that many American buildings looked to the Parthenon as a model, because it could embody all of the ideals of this new American democratic experiment. Now, many of the founding fathers were classically educated, Thomas Jefferson being a great example of that, as well as also John Adams, who was told off by his father for not studying his Latin. His father put him outside to build a brick wall until he basically, or sorry, a wall, until he actually was willing to come back in and do his Latin, because every good cultured official person should have Latin. But the important part is Latin and a classical education was essential to creating an informed citizenry who could govern justly. To quote Carolyn Winterer, classicism was also an important part of civic culture. For example, George Washington showed his troops the 1712 play Cato by Joseph Addison when stationed at Valley Forge. This play dramatized Cato the Younger's principled opposition to Julius Caesar before his death, a suitable topic for a Revolutionary War era. Unsurprisingly, the architectural ideals of the new nation took a classical, and at this moment, predominantly Greek form. Now, but most Americans, and most Europeans for that matter, couldn't go to Greece. Greece at this point was still under control of the Ottoman Empire. So most knowledge of these monuments reached Americans through publications and through archaeological publications, one of which most famous ones is the Antiquity of Athens, which was published by James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette. And here you can see one of their drawings of the Parthenon. Of course, as you know, the Parthenon was converted into a church and then converted into a mosque. It was also used as a munitions storage area under the Venetians as well. So it's had a very varied history in terms of its afterlife. But you can start to see these would be the images that many Americans would have had of Athens, and particularly of the Parthenon. Here's a kind of reconstructed drawing as well. Now, these books were very expensive at the time. However, there were copies circulating in the United States. For example, Thomas Jefferson had numerous books on architecture, including books on Palladio. And then Ethel Towne, whose work I'll discuss in a moment, had an estimated 11,000 volumes and 20,000 engravings, which other artists and architects had access to. So a lot of these images were circulating at this time. Now, these images came home to roost in one of the most iconic buildings in New York City's history, which is, oops, sorry, that's the Erection, another classical building that was often copied. This came to roost at Federal Hall, otherwise known today as 26 Wall Street, or the Customs House, again, Federal Hall. So now what happened was, in 1704, there was a new Georgian-style city hall that was built here. Pierre Elephant, who planned the grid of Washington, D.C., and as I already mentioned, kind of put together the Montgomery Memorial, had remodeled the building into the nation's first Capitol building, calling it Federal Hall. And it was here that George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States on April 30th, 1789. Now, this much celebrated building met the fate that many of New York's historical buildings have. It was demolished in 1812 and row houses were erected instead. You know, many of us bemoan the plight of historic buildings, but it's something that happens in New York all the time, sadly. Then as now, New York City was the epicenter of New York City's economy. Between 1817 and 1825, the Erie Canal had been constructed by the sheer will of DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York. And that watercourse was essential because it basically connected New York Harbor, which was going to be the biggest harbor in New York, and was really trying to make sure that it continued to outpace Boston and Philadelphia to the agricultural kind of inner part of the United States. So it was very important. But the other reason why it was so important for getting not only goods in, but getting goods into the United States, not goods just from the agricultural hinterland. In 1852, 95% of the US federal government's revenue came from customs duties, the tariffs put on imported goods. And New York City accounted for an astounding 80% of this revenue. In other words, New York City was supporting the federal government. Between 1799 and 1850, the Custom House was down at Bowling Green at Government House, and then it moved back to one of the row houses on this exact spot. But in 1833, it was decided that the US Customs Service actually needed a proper building, an impressive building. And so they picked the site of Federal Hall again, and it was decided to hire Town and Davis to design the new Customs House. Now, Ethel Town was a very talented engineer and architect. He invented and patented the Town lattice truss for bridges, which made him incredibly wealthy. And he also, in 1827, opened an architectural office with the polymath Alexander Jackson Davis, who many of you will know his drawings, beautiful colored illustrations of commissions he got or didn't get, and they worked together for 7 years. And in many ways, you know, Town and Davis was the McKim, Mead and White of its era. It won prestigious commissions left, right, and center, including designing the Capitol building for the state Capitol building for Connecticut, North Carolina, and Indiana. And they designed the Customs House. And this is the design. So you can see one of Davis's drawings of it. It is a clear homage to the Parthenon. You can see that there's a double row of Doric columns along both ends of the porticos. There are triglyphs and metopes as well. And there are acroteria located on the peak of the pediment and on the raking cornices at the end. You can also see that clearly a dome was intended, which is evoking Rome's Pantheon at the same time. So there was really, at least in the original conception of this building, a mixing of these two ideas. Now, construction began in January 1834, and Samuel Thompson, who worked on Schnuck Harbor, which I'll discuss in a moment, was hired as the builder. And he was told almost immediately to like tone down the design, kind of get the escalating prices and costs under control. And he did that. Subsequently, the dome was reduced. It was moved more towards Wall Street, and it was not built as a double portico, but a single portico along each edge. However, hiring Thompson didn't work very well. And the US Customs Service eventually in April 1835, after he'd been hired for a few months, reduced his responsibilities and pay. So of course he did what anyone would do, which is he ran off with the plans and quit. So that left the US Customs Service in a bit of a pickle. So what they did then was hire stonemason turned architect John Fries to complete the building. So he had to draft his own plans based on the foundation that had already been laid out by Thompson. His major design change to it was making the third story a proper kind of actual story rather than an attic. And he used thick French glass that resembled marble that he put within the metapiece to bring in light. So when you go and look at the building today, it looks like it's stone, but in fact, there's actually natural light that goes in. Now, finally, in 1842, the building opened. And Nassau Street, as you know, slopes down sharply between Pine Streets and Wall Streets. From here, we're on Wall Street looking north. And it really gives the Customs House an imposing air. So I kind of can imagine a merchant who's just kind of crossed the Atlantic, and he's kind of gotten off and he's walking to go pay his customs duty. And he is met by this extraordinary building. And it must have been a moment of kind of awe and surprise at this classical temple that greeted him. The pediment has no sculpture. It doesn't seem to have ever been designed for it. And that may have been an aesthetic choice. Francis Moroni has suggested this may reflect a kind of romantic cult of ruins, but also given the economic realities, it's expensive to have sculpture. And the fact that really there weren't a lot of qualified and talented sculptors in the United States at this point, it's not surprising that there was really no sculpture added. Now, once you walk up into this beautiful Doric portico, you are met by a surprised, wonderful, airy rotunda, which clearly, again, looks to the Pantheon. This is where you would have to come in and actually pay your duty. This is the customs, the actual customs collector's room. So there would have been a number of desks set up in it, and you would go in and do that. Now, within about 20 years, the Customs Service outgrew its home at 26 Wall Street, and it moved to the former Merchants Exchange at 55 Wall Street, which is today where Cipriani Wall Street is. 26 Wall Street then became a federal sub-treasury building until 1920. So despite its demotion in 1862, it has remained a historical anchor to this very day. In 1883, John Quincy Ward Adams added this statue of George Washington here to commemorate the centennial of the end of the Revolutionary War. And in 1955, it was renamed Federal Hall, and in 1965, it was landmarked. But it remains historically important. Since 1800, Congress has only met outside of Washington, D.C. twice. In 1987, it met in Philadelphia to commemorate the bicentennial of the ratification of the Constitution. And second, on September 11th, 2002, Congress met here to commemorate the one-year memorial of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So thus, kind of ancient architectural forms still resonate. They are symbols of the nation's pride, of resilience, of collective loss, and democratic values. The building has also anchored the neighborhood as the New York Stock Exchange here with business integrity, which strikes me as ironic in the wake of the Great Recession, kind of watching over the works of man, she's right there, and then the Bankers Trust Building, which is modeled on, at least on the top, on the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus and on the Campanile of St. Mark's from Venice in terms of its long shaft. Now, you can see why these buildings, these forms were used for civic and financial architecture, but they were also used in unexpected ways. And so we're going to Staten Island right now to look at Schnuck Harbor. This is a retirement community, or it was in its original conception. Today, it's a cultural center. Arguably, one of the most important groups, if not some of the best examples of Greek revival architecture in the United States, is Schnuck Harbor on Staten Island. So Robert Richard Randall, who was an affluent merchant, made a provision in his will that his Manhattan farm, which bordered today's Washington Square, so a prime piece of real estate even then, that in his will, he should establish a marine hospital for aged, decrepit, and worn out sailors. After lawsuits, because there are always lawsuits, after the will had been settled, the trustees kept the Manhattan farm to produce income to support Schnuck Harbor, located on 130 acres on the North Shore of Staten Island. It actually still has beautiful views looking over towards New Jersey and looking back towards Manhattan. Again, when we're able to travel around, it's a wonderful day out to get on the Staten Island ferry and go down to see these extraordinary buildings. The main building, which is Building C right here in the center, was completed in August 1833, and it was flanked by buildings B here and D here. And these were designed by Minard Lefebvre, who is a very prominent early American architect who also wrote large numbers of building manuals. So his building manuals were the things that builders and kind of the nascent field of architecture could use to erect these beautiful buildings. And then around 1880, these last two buildings were added, actually under Thomas Melville, the brother of Herman Melville, who had managed Schnuck Harbor from 1867 to 1884. So while Greek architecture was used extensively in New York City till about 1850, it was not the only architecture in the game in early New York City. Egypt also had a special role to play. Starting in the mid-18th century, publications of Egyptian antiquities started to popularize Egypt's art and architecture and sparked a new wave of Egyptomania, or a desire for all things Egyptian. Detailed illustrations and analyses of Egyptian books by Comte Cass and Piranesi made Egyptian art more accessible. When he invaded Egypt in 1789, Napoleon, like his hero and model, Alexander the Great, brought scientists and scholars with him to document the campaign. Published over a period of 2 decades and in 22 volumes, the description of Egypt, simply put, was revolutionary. It was a major scientific publication that contained extensive descriptions, plates of Egypt's archaeological sites, flora, fauna, and people. The description brought Egyptian antiquities to a much, much broader audience in Europe and the United States. Patrons, architects, and engineers soon started to perceive Egyptian architecture as having the qualities of strength, permanence, technical superiority, and monumentality, in addition to the funereal context and overtones that it had always had. So considering that at this moment in the early 19th century, Egyptian architecture is associated with technological progress, monumentality, strength, and permanence, it is not surprising that one of New York City's first infrastructure projects also looked to Egypt: the Croton Aqueduct, and more importantly, the Murray Hill Distributing Reservoir. As early as 1774, New Yorkers acknowledged that they needed a clean, regular supply of water. At this point, really, the collect pond in southern Manhattan is the only thing, and that's pretty bad. Now, unfortunately, this need would not be really addressed until the 1830s, after yet another outbreak of cholera convinced the Common Council that New York City really, in fact, needed a good, reliable source of clean water. None was to be found on the island, but the tributary of Croton, which fed the Hudson, was identified. And so a resolution was passed to create an aqueduct. W.B. Douglas served as the chief engineer until October 1836, when John B. Jervis replaced him. Construction started in May 1837 and was completed on June 22nd, 1842. Now, many of you, if you drive up the Taconic Parkway and you're on the east side of the Hudson, you will go over the enormous reservoir. But we know that the water originally flowed over what is called the High Bridge. And here's the High Bridge today. And there's a nice little plaque kind of showing the work that was done to create the bridge. Again, if you're able to be out and walking in New York City, I can tell you on an early Saturday morning, there is no one around this site, but it's really spectacular and you have extraordinary views, and it's a great walk between the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. So the water would then basically come from the Croton Reservoir, go across the aqueduct at the East River, go over the East River here, and it would eventually then go to the receiving reservoir, which is located between 79th Street and 86th Streets between 6th and 7th Avenue. Remember, there's no Central Park at this point. And here then, the water would travel down to the colossal Murray Hill Distributing Reservoir, which had a capacity of 20 million imperial gallons. The reservoir, which you can see in this slide, stretched from 40th to 42nd Street at 5th Avenue, occupying half of a crosstown block. As the highest point in the middle of Manhattan, Murray Hill was an ideal place for the reservoir because gravity helped to distribute the water to the densely populated tip of Lower Manhattan. Now, obviously, the aqueduct designed by John Jervis had parallels to those of ancient Rome, but the distributing reservoir looked clearly and distinctively to Egypt for its model. On June 27th, 1842, water began its 40-odd mile long journey from Croton to New York City, arriving at the distributing reservoir for the 4th of July. American flags flew from the reservoir's corners, and thousands of New Yorkers trooped uptown to marvel at what was sure to be the first of the city's many engineering and architectural achievements. Rather than enjoying a celebratory glass of cider, early Americans' favorite drinks — we can thank Johnny Appleseed for bringing fermented cider to everyone — these 20,000 New Yorkers who came to celebrate the reservoir and the aqueduct received a glass of pure, fresh water. Like the Erie Canal, the aqueduct and its reservoirs were representative of what the new American nation could accomplish together. James Renwick Jr., later the architect of Grace Church and the Smithsonian, designed the distributing reservoir and supervised its construction. The distributing reservoir was built of massive gray stone blocks in the style of an Egyptian temple, as you can see here. As you can see, it's got an Egyptian cornice as well as what they call pileasters. They call this a pileaster. It's really more of a pylon with a projecting cornice along here. What's interesting to note is that the cornice is actually noted in the bill, in the contractor's bill, as a particular line. So there was extra expense spent on the cornice to make sure that it looked Egyptian and appropriate. The walls also sloped inwards, which is another typical feature of Egyptian architecture. And this slope also helped to counter the force of the water. According to Jervis, the Egyptian cornice, quote, accorded with the general style of the work. And his approval suggests that the employment of Egyptianizing architecture for the distributing reservoir was a suitable choice. Contemporary responses to the building underscored the fitting nature of Egyptian architecture. On June 22nd, 1842, the New York Daily Tribune observed that, quote, The style of the architecture is Egyptian, well fitted by its heavy and imposing character for a work of such magnitude, unquote. Other newspapers and magazines reprinted this article in full or in part, indicating the widely held sentiment that Egyptian architecture was suitable for such a structure. Clean water was transformative for New York City. It curtailed disease and furthered the city's rapid expansion. Like the fountains that were located along the end or at the end of Rome's aqueducts, the Murray Hill Distributing Reservoir was not only a symbol of progress, but also an amenity. From the Fifth Avenue entrance, as you can see here, you could go up on top and promenade. And from here, you could see New Jersey and Brooklyn as well. At the same time, the reservoir also monumentalized this part of Fifth Avenue. So this is between 40th and 42nd Street. Now, in that sense, the Egyptian reservoir was truly a fitting terminus for an impressive piece of infrastructure, which physically embodied what New York and the United States were capable of in the 1840s. However, by the 1890s, the monumentality of imperial Rome had supplanted Egypt's technological superiority, and the reservoir was now considered an unhealthy eyesore. The reservoir was torn down and replaced with the main branch of New York Public Library. Although if you actually go into the library, when you're able to do that, and you can actually still see some of the original gray blocks that were repurposed and used in the foundation of the library. So it is a kind of very useful predecessor as Charles Gray, as it was once called. Now, unsurprisingly, if Roman architecture, specifically Roman imperial brass, kind of started to replace Egyptian architecture, it's not surprising that they were then used in the major infrastructure projects. Now, we know, many of you will know Penn Station and Grand Central Terminal, of course, as the obvious, most famous examples probably of neoclassical or neo-antique architecture in New York City. I just wanted to highlight them here because you kind of can't talk about antiquity in New York City without mentioning them. The one thing I would say is that I think Penn Station is a really good reminder, as is Grand Central, of why these buildings were so successful in certain ways, because they were both functionally effective and aesthetically pleasing. These are modeled on the baths of Caracalla, and ancient baths have the same problems that train stations have. They have to move a lot of people in and out of them effectively and efficiently. Ancient Roman baths have to cycle people through all the different cool and hot pools and temperatures of the baths. And the train stations have got to get people in and out, going to and from their trains. So in many ways, the same design problems are there. And in fact, we know that McKim, who designed the old Pennsylvania station, actually went to the baths of Caracalla with Daniel Burnham and a few others, and actually sketched workers walking through. He hired workers for the day to walk through the ruins so he could figure out how they were moving. So I just think that's a really interesting way that we see where design is driven by both kind of form and function in these two buildings. These buildings are very indicative, though, of the change. And from the 1880s through to the 1920s, many of New York's most iconic buildings looked to ancient Rome. The United States was on the economic rise and, of course, would have a territorial empire by the end of the 19th century. Classical architecture also started to signify the possession of high or elite culture. So it became popular for museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As many of you know, this is not the first building that the Met has. We're on building number 3 here, and then we're putting wings on it. But this is what they decided eventually that they needed. They needed something classical. And I've also got included photographs of Lowell Library at Columbia and the Gould Memorial Library, which was at NYU's Uptown campus, now Bronx Community College, part of CUNY. Now, these ones are all quite well known, although the Gould Memorial Library should probably be better known, although I know to many of the members of the Architecture Committee, it is a well-known building, and to many New Yorkers, it is as well. But there is a little known building that is now raised, Lowenschon Stadium at City College, which also looked to antiquity for its model. So founded as the Free Academy, City College provided a free education to some of New York City's brightest but poorest students. I'm proud to say my dad was a graduate of City College, so it is a very special place for me. By the 1870s, though, City College had outgrown its James Renwick design building at 23rd Street in Lexington, today basically where Baruch is. Like NYU and Columbia, City College wanted a more bucolic, spacious location for its campus, and so it moved to the area known as Hamilton Heights in Upper Manhattan. Of course, you can go see Hamilton Grange, which is right by City College today. The architectural core of the campus was a series of Gothic buildings designed by George B. Post, who also designed the New York Stock Exchange. Now, due to the increasing popularity of college athletics at the start of the 20th century, John Finley, a classicist and the third president of City College from 1903 to 1913, decided that the college needed new athletic facilities. So he convinced the city to give him a small park between 136th Street and 138th Street, between Amsterdam and Coven Avenues. Finley also persuaded Adolf Lohenschön, a German immigrant and self-made millionaire, to underwrite the cost of a stadium named in his honor. The architect Arnold W. Brunner, who created the public baths, today known as the Astor-Levy Baths on 23rd Street, started construction on the stadium in 1913, and it was completed in 1915. Now, the stadium was composed of a single level of seating with a Doric portico, which you can see here, as well as a Doric pavilions at the end. The stadium's design belongs to Finley again. During the 1915 dedication of the ceremony of the stadium, he noted that, quote, "The structure has the outlook of the theater near San Onofrio on the Janiculum, but it has the sweep of the ellipse of the Colosseum, and it has, as I recall, the diameter and dimension of the great theater at Epidaurus. Many years ago, I heard a lecture on this theater, and I was greatly encouraged in the planning for the City College Theater or Stadium." So while the stadium was not a proper theater or amphitheater, it was clearly inspired by the entertainment venues of antiquity rather than a mere copy of an ancient model. Appropriately, the stadium's inaugural event was the staging of Euripides' Trojan Women, and Shakespearean productions followed. Now, the college immediately put the stadium to use, regularly hosting football games and athletic competition. The stadium also housed City College's graduation ceremony when leading politicians, including Martin Luther King Jr., in 1963 gave the commencement address. The stadium, though, as Lohenschön noted in the New York Times, was always intended to serve the public. Quote, "I would like to see the stadium busy from morning and evenings, Sunday and holidays included. Of course, the City College students have to use it for instruction, but I would like to have it for the benefit of everyone, for all the people of the city if possible. While it is the City College Stadium, it is going to be the stadium of the city of New York. Until it was raised in 1973 and replaced by the North Academic Center, Lohenschön Stadium was, in the opinions of the New York Times, the working man's, quote, outdoor Carnegie Hall with the patrons in shirt sleeves and workspan. Gershwin brought Rhapsody in Blue here, and Marian Anderson made her debut here. So it made concerts and music, often the purview of the elites, accessible to many more New Yorkers. In 1923, City College also received an inscribed funerary stele, which Finley called the Marathon Stone. This stele, a grave stele, was erected around 350 BC and stood along a route that reportedly a runner had taken between Marathon and Athens to announce the victory of the Greeks over the Persians, except the stele has no actual connection to the event. That said, this was part of Finley's kind of ambition to kind of raise City College to be the level of, Columbia and NYU, to kind of demonstrate that the, quote, Harvard of the proletariat, as City College has been called, was as important and as elite and as special, although at the same time as accessible to its more kind of socially prestigious rivals. The Marathon Stone today is on display in the Met in Wing J, so you can go see it there. But I think the Marathon Stone and the stadium are good reminders of how archaeology and architecture inspired by antiquity did in fact bring people together, because people could go to the stadium and enjoy affordable concerts, and it kind of brought the cultural life to a different part of and a different population of New York City. Now, monumental arches, the last thing I'm going to talk about, were some of the most, there's City College with the stone in situ. So Roman arches, first erected in the Roman Forum in 198 BCE, were some of the most widespread monumental and commemorative types of architecture in the Roman world. They were discursive monuments whose form and function and inscriptions and sculptures really presented highly constructed views of an individual's achievements or a people's achievements. Rome was home to the most famous, two of which you can see here, the Arch of Titus and the Arch of Constantine. But very quickly after the fall of antiquity, arches were being repurposed, and temporary arches were erected in the early modern period to celebrate the coronations of James I and Charles I of England. And of course, during the 18th and 19th century, famous arches were erected in London, Berlin, and of course, Paris, the Arc de Triomphe, to celebrate military victories. So the arches, ancient and European associations, made it appealing to Americans who sought an architectural language to honor their heroes and veterans. Now, temporary arches were first erected to celebrate the centennial anniversary of Washington's inauguration. Actually, that's not quite. There were temporary arches erected when Lafayette came back to visit. So there's this tradition of erecting them in honor of men who were important to the revolution. These are temporary arches, one that's just north of Washington Square, and the rather hokey one that was erected at Madison Square Park. There was also an arch erected at Wall Street. These were very popular. Stanford White designed the temporary arch, and then it resulted in the creation of a permanent arch to celebrate Washington's centennial, and also to attempt to educate people who were new to America, particularly immigrants, about George Washington and what he represented. But the arch I really want to talk about today is the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch and Grand Army Plaza, Brooklyn. In the 1880s, Brooklyn started to plan to erect a permanent monument to commemorate its Civil War veterans and to present a very specific Northern vision and memory of the Civil War. Because so many veterans were starting to pass away, monuments to citizen soldiers proliferated across every town, city, village, and hamlet in the North and the South. Many of these statues erected between 1880 and 1920 to both Union and Confederate soldiers have caused many controversies in the 21st century. And the debates over whether monuments to Confederate soldiers are inherently racist or celebrate the lost cause rhetoric of the South demonstrates that these monuments are far from being forgotten relics of American history. So in the case of this arch, originally the Brooklyn Common Council had planned to build a 90-foot shaft or column with allegorical statues. But Alfred C. Chapin, who was mayor at the time, vetoed it because he basically said it kind of looks like the obelisks that are in Greenwood Cemetery, and that's not suitable enough. So in 1888, they held a design competition for a, quote, memorial arch of granite to be erected at Prospect Park's northern entrance. John H. Duncan's design won the competition. Duncan also designed Grant's tomb. And between 1889 and 1892, the arch was erected. Brooklyn issued a bond of $250,000 to pay for it, and they also used tax levies as well. And that indicates that this is really a kind of civic project. While Duncan did do the original design, Stanford White was also involved and changed the size. And actually what we can see in the archives of the New York Historical Society and the McKim, Mead and White archives is that in fact, many of the things that White had originally wanted for the Washington Arch, which he couldn't get funded, he did here instead. Such as the quadrigia, the sculptural groups. The sculptural groups on the Washington Arch are not added until I think 1916 and 1918. So many of those ideas are here. So the monuments kind of go together in certain ways. Now the arch was very much conceived of as an arch that referenced not only the Arch of Titus, but also the Arc de Triomphe. Frederick Mcmoneys, who was the sculptor, had lived in Paris for about 30 years. And in writing letters back and forth to White, he specifically refers to it as an Arch of Triumph. And the Arc de Triomphe, which you can see here, we'll talk about the sculptural groups in a moment, and the Arch du Carrousel with its quadrigia were clearly two of the monuments that Mcmoneys was referencing. So what we can see in this arch here is that we have, again, a reference to an ancient monument that's also doing that through European predecessors. So part of this is kind of New York's way of saying we can create art as good as Europe. And we are a metropolis like these great European cities. But what I think is of most interest, and with my limited time left, since it's almost been 45 minutes, is I want to talk about the sculptural groups, particularly the Army and the Navy. They are clearly modeled on the sculptural groups on the Arc de Triomphe, which immediately draws a parallel between the American soldiers who fought to save the Union to the soldiers of the French Revolution, and also to those who fought in the Napoleonic Wars. But I think the reference to the French Revolution is very powerful because, again, it's showing these soldiers fighting for kind of the ideals. And these are ideals that transcend, that are very important. And if you're trying to construct historical narratives, essential. So the first one we have is the Army urged on by the genus of patriotism. This is patriotism here. And what you can see is really the totality of all the different ages of men. We have enlisted men, we have officers, we see people dying. It's a very kind of dramatic composition. Of more interest, perhaps, though, is the Navy. Because again, we have the genus of patriotism, and we have an older man and a younger man. But the most interesting figure is undoubtedly the African-American sailor who's here. He is dressed in similar garb to this standing figure. They are both bare-breasted, and they have trousers on as they are normally enlisted men. So his position is front and center, acknowledging the contributions of African-Americans from the different Brooklyn regiments who fought here. But he's also kneeling. And as Kirk Savage has shown in his book on Civil War memorials, that many of the ex-slave memorials, including the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln, show slaves in kneeling positions. And so it's a very ambiguous view at all. So I think it sums up in many ways the very ambiguous position of African Americans after the Civil War, that they are both included in the North, but not quite, and speaks to some of the longer term issues that we're still trying to deal with today in the United States. Now, the sculpture continues with, we have victories, and we have a very clear statement to the defenders of the Union, 1861 to 1865. This is a clear version of the North's view of the war. And you can see the two victories. This one here on the right, if you're looking at them, is very important. She has the fasces, the symbol of power from Republican Rome, and she holds a tablet that says Constitution. So it's very clear, it's explicit that the Constitution has authority, and the North was enforcing the Constitution. It was saving the Constitution. It was defending the Constitution. So it justifies the North's position in the war. And then on top, we have the progress of Colombia. And so Colombia, who becomes this kind of alternative personification of the United States, is a way that we can see everybody in a sense trying to come together, that the United States is going to progress forward under the banner of progress and under the banner of Colombia. And so some of the failings of Reconstruction, the failing of integrating ex-slaves and African Americans into the new American narratives are kind of pushed here under the idea of reconciliation, and that being more important. The only other thing to say, though, is this is truly a monument that is dedicated to the soldiers and sailors, because Lincoln and Grant only appear on the inside. And so if you're looking at this monument, you really have to pass inside the bay to look at it. In fact, if you're looking outside at it from the side, you can really see that, in fact, it is a monument that celebrates these different individuals, the soldiers and sailors. The other thing to note is if you are going to, if you say you live in Brooklyn and you're not too far and you can go out and walk safely, you can see these little roundels, all of which have the symbols of different regiments. And so you could also imagine soldiers and sailors coming to this monument, being able to speak with their families and their loved ones about their service and to acknowledge and recognize all of these, their great contributions. We can also see then that the Soldiers and Sailors Arch kind of grounds and situates the neighborhood. And so you can start to see this array of columns going into Prospect Park, and it starts to kind of monumentalize this entrance. We can also start to see the beginnings of the Brooklyn Museum. At that point, the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, it's not called the Brooklyn Museum until the 1930s, being built there. And so you kind of have this locus of kind of neoclassical buildings that's starting to form here as well. So in sum, I'd like to say that ancient architecture, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Near Eastern, which I've not had time to discuss here, but you can see at the Pythian Temple on the upper west side, was always present in New York City. It's fluid, flexible, and diverse. And it was a source that basically anyone could draw upon to create different types of buildings, whether it be a tomb, which you can see here of Henry Bergh, who is the founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or Jay Gould, famous robber baron, and that each architect, patron, or individual could kind of cherry pick from the forms and motifs that they wanted to create to make a building that suited the functional needs and the symbolic needs that they desired. So I hope that this whistle stop tour has intrigued you, and I hope it will encourage you to go out and walk when you're able to do so and to enjoy this wonderful city. Thank you very much. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Okay.
And I'm going to begin sharing my screen at this point. This was an absolutely fascinating lecture. I don't know how you covered so many things, Lizzie, within 45 minutes, as you said. Some people say you spoke quickly. I'm so glad you did. There was so much we had to hear. I just want to make a comment about your beginning. I, for one, I've never been down to the September 11th memorial. It's not for me yet. Whether I will or not remains to be seen. But I wanted to say something because you begin with a quote from Virgil, and that's about Aeneas. He was a Trojan prince. He traveled far before he finally made it to Italy. And one of the places we know is Carthage for Dido and Aeneas. And it's wonderful parallel because he was an immigrant to Italy. He changed the course of Italy with the exception of the indigenous populations and those enslaved Africans who were brought here. We all are descendant from immigrants. So I'm so glad you began that way. And for those who don't know, I must say, since you brought up your father, he is perhaps the greatest benefactor of all time to the city universities. So I think that's so important and where we all come from. And connected the city universities, the Trojan women, again, Troy, this is everyone's heritage, the classical. So thank you very much for that fascinating talk. I do have some questions which I received to ask you. The first one is from Margaret. There's a map on the Antiquities in Gotham website, locating sites with classical influence. Why are most in Lower Manhattan?
I think they're not, there's a concentration of them in Lower Manhattan. There are more when you get going around. Part of it is I didn't put everyone in for Woodlawn or Greenwood because those two are such locuses of many different buildings. I think part of it is that when we were more densely populated in Lower Manhattan to start with, and so that's where many of these buildings were originally erected, including some that don't survive anymore. And so I think there's naturally a concentration there, and then it kind of goes and gets more spread out because as New York is kind of, or certainly as Manhattan is progressing up the island, there are also other different architectural influences that are going on at the same time. So I think that's probably why there's a concentration there.
Okay. And talking about the cemetery, it was one of the first programs that the Architecture and Archaeology Committee co-sponsored. So it's a perfect parallel. This is from Lynn. As a Soho resident, I live amongst cast iron facade buildings, mostly constructed in the second half of the 19th century, using classical motifs. Are there any correlations of design with buildings made of stone and concrete?
Yeah, and there actually are, I didn't have a chance to talk about them, but there are some good examples of warehouses that do have a more purposeful or more thoughtful engagement with the classics as opposed to the kind of structural nature. So for example, the Austin Nickel and Company warehouse, which is over in Brooklyn, has an Egyptian cornice. It's now being converted into condos. It's an example of a building that was landmarked and the landmark was overturned. But that was designed by Cass Gilbert, and it was specifically designed to kind of be this big, massive, very state-of-the-art warehouse. But the cornice was picked to be Egyptian, and it was picked to be that because, again, it was kind of strong and strength. And then actually on at 130 West 30th Street, the building today that's called the Cass Gilbert, which is condos, that was also a warehouse, and that uses ancient Near Eastern motifs. And it's specifically they're designed, it's made of bricks and concrete, and it's designed and terracotta, and it's designed to have step backs. And then there are Neo-Hittite reliefs that are actually over the two main entrances. So most of the times the warehouses are not embellished, but there are a couple of examples that I could find where it was done that. And actually Cass Gilbert, in the case of the building at 130 West 30th Street, he was hired specifically as like a big name so that people would want to rent space in the building because Cass Gilbert had designed it. And he kind of said like he was an intellectual, he was an artistic magpie. So he picked these motifs and put them up there.
Okay, thank you. Steve has sort of related his question. What do you think of buildings that borrow elements from one style and combined it with elements from another style.
Oh, I love them, I have to say. So in the last slide, I showed the Pythian Temple, and the Pythian Temple, so that's if you're on the west side, it's 135, I think, West 70th. Apologies if I've confused which cross street it is. It's an awesome building. It's so incredibly wacky. So it has Egyptian motifs. Actually, if you step further enough back and look at the top part of it, it has color. It basically has pharaohs seated, the ones that are, they copy the ones at Abu Simbel and that were moved from the High Dam in Aswan. They're up at the top and they're painted red, so they're highly recognizable. On the ground level, there are Lamassu, who are the kind of guardian winged lions and bulls of ancient Assyria, and they're along the street level. So when you look at this building, also it has Near Eastern griffins, and then it also has like asps from Egypt. And it's kind of visually overwhelming, but it's also really interesting because to me, it kind of all works. And that's one of the things that I like when thinking about these buildings, thinking about them as neo-antique, not just neoclassical, because there is this melding. The other building that melds things is also the Fred French building, which is on Fifth Avenue in Midtown. The top of it has bees and it has griffins and the head of Mercury. And Fred French is the developer of Tudor City, and he developed the co-op plan. So he's very important. So on the top of his headquarters, he has this, this kind of Mercury, Mercury and bees and griffins. And then on the ground level, again, he's got all these Near Eastern motifs. He's got double bowl columns from Susa. He's got the Lamassu, and he's melding and mixing. And I think part of the times the melding and mixing is because it's very original and it's a way to distinguish your building. And I think if you're in Midtown and you're trying to compete, it's good to have different distinguishing features.
Thank you. From Faye, and this is, we've all heard the political clamors that have been going on with buildings, with monuments, and that monuments often reflect events of a certain era.
Okay.
Is there any movement to let the history stand while seeking by contemporary artists a mode of expressing their response?
There are in a couple of different ways. So the first one, like the Column of Columbus, is obviously quite controversial. There are people who feel that it, shouldn't still be there. There are Italian Americans who feel very strongly that it should be. The interesting thing about that building or that monument is that it was entirely paid for by Italian Americans. It's not a creation of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. It's a creation of Italian Americans, and on the inscriptions are both in English and Italian. So it's kind of an interesting monument. But then Tazu Nishi, who's a Japanese artist, did an installation around it in 2012. It was on when Hurricane Sandy was happening, so it was a kind of like supremely surreal. But that you could go up and look at it and kind of sit with it and be with it. And he felt that the column and Columbus kind of embodied American pop culture in a weird way. So I thought that was a really interesting, different interpretation to look at it. Now, that is obviously before a lot of the changes that we've had in the last year. And I think we will see people looking at these monuments differently going forward. In the case of the Teddy Roosevelt statue at the American Museum of Natural History, they actually did an exhibition called Addressing the Statue, trying to address the problems of the statue. And so that's not really an artist engaging with it, but it's a museum trying to deal with its own history, Roosevelt's history, and talking about it. I think the only other example of two kind of contemporary engagements would also be on Flatbush Avenue. There are Miss Manhattan and Miss Brooklyn rotate. They were originally part of the pylons that are part of the Manhattan Bridge. So if you drive over on Flatbush Avenue, there are like rotating neoclassical statues. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of people are still interested in engaging with them, but it's just a very complex engagement. And that's what makes them kind of interesting for us.
Thank you. The reservoir that you spoke about so wonderfully, were homes displaced at that point or other buildings? And do you know where the residents would have moved to?
I don't know. I don't think anyone was displaced at that point because it was still pretty open fields there, but I'm not certain. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure.
Okay. And I know our time is getting close. I'm going to do one more, but I want you to know there are so many wonderful questions. And if I get a list of them, I will send them on to Lizzie, but you have to put in your email address, so you'll get a response directly. I assume this relates to the Brooklyn arch that we saw. What is the material used for the statues?
They are bronze. So Mccauley casted them in bronze and they were sent over from Paris.
Well, I want to thank you once again for a fabulous presentation. It was all that I hoped for and more. So I thank you sincerely. I want to mention how pleased we are with Lizzie on our committee. And we have 2 more programs that are coming up. On December 8th at 1 o'clock, Paul Cartledge will be speaking from England about Thebes. And we happen to have another program on classical art with James Wright. Both Paul and James have spoken before at the club. And James will be talking about Komos in Crete. May I now, Steve Cass.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, I'm Steve Cass, and I am speaking for the National Arts Club. And on behalf of the Board of Governors of the club, I want to thank you for joining us for today's wonderful program. A quick note to all our viewers and to Lizzie. She mentioned George B. Post, the architect who designed the main tower at City College up at Hamilton Heights. George B. Post was also the architect of the National Arts Club studio building, which is directly adjacent to the Arts Club. The Arts Club, of course, is on 20th Street, Gramercy Park South, and we go through to 19th Street. And attached to the back of our building is a 14-story building, 1906, George B. Post. We're doing some renovation work out there right now, and we've come across some of George Post's original plans for the building. Whether in person or online during the pandemic, the 15 arts programs committees of the National Arts Club produce a rich, robust collection of programs every week, free to the public. Be sure to see our website, nationalartsclub.org, to see more about the club, our calendar, and upcoming programs. Thank you for your support, and I hope to see you in person at the club when we are permitted to go live once again. In-person programming resumes. For now, thanks for being with us here at the National Arts Club.